Younger Canadians are frustrated. The last few years have seen sharp increases in the cost of living, and younger Canadians are running up against those challenges seemingly everywhere they go. Whether it's at the grocery store, when they're meeting their friends for drinks or dinner, or especially when they're paying their rent, or if they're lucky enough, their mortgage. And for many households, the once accessible milestone of home ownership feels increasingly out of reach. Although affordability has been challenging at other points in the past, saving enough for a down payment for past generations felt more achievable. Well, with their political future uncertain, the Liberal Party released their federal budget on April 16th and are selling it as a budget that promises fairness for every generation. In theory, that should be music to the ears of millennials and Gen Z. But does that framing hold up under the microscope? That's what we'll be diving into today. Hi, everyone. I'm Erik Johnson, Vice President and Senior Economist at BMO Capital Markets. Welcome to the series of special episodes of BMO Smarter Investing, where we'll be focusing the conversation on issues on the minds of our younger audience members. And with me today to get that conversation started is my fellow BMO economist and millennial, Shelly Kaushik. Welcome to the pod, Shelly.
Thanks, Erik. I'm happy to be here and I'm excited to kick off this series.
Now, of course, I know what you do at BMO, but maybe for the benefit of the audience, can you dive a little bit into your role at BMO here for us?
Yeah, for sure. So my focus is primarily on the Canadian macroeconomy. I create some of our forecasts for major economic indicators and I analyze the data as they come out. On top of the broader macroeconomic themes, I also follow provincial and regional economies as well as any fiscal developments. So that's the budget, any fiscal updates, or any announcements that either give money to the government or cost them in additional spending. And that would be for both the federal and provincial governments across Canada.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Shelly. And I'm excited to hear some of your insights today. So to kick off the conversation, I wanted to kind of level set us with a little bit of the context for the audience. And so Canadian households often get labeled as having a serious debt problem. And certainly if we just compare in an aggregate sense, where we are relative to the United States, you do get a little bit of that flavor. Obviously, having a forced deleveraging cycle about 15 years ago in the United States drastically changed the trajectory there versus here. And I think one thing I wanted to push back a little bit on that is it's not exactly that we have this big aggregate challenge everywhere, but if you zoom in a little bit, what you actually see is, where Canadian households are today, if we kind of measure their household debt against financial assets, so those would include things like stocks and their residential real estate wealth and all those other things that go into net worth there. They're actually doing certainly better than they were in the financial crisis. Makes sense. That was a pretty tough time for both equity markets and a little bit less so for housing markets in Canada, but certainly a big flavor of that was going on south of the border here. And so we also really haven't changed very much on that metric relative to kind of before the pandemic. I think, but what is really, really stark is if we get into the granularity of what that, kind of household debt problem looks like at different parts of the demographic spectrum there, that's when you really see those challenges. So if we're comparing kind of older households, so whether that's, Gen Xers or baby boomers or maybe even some of the baby boomer parents, they actually have quite sizable financial buffers relative to their household debt. So certainly we're talking, at a minimum being in the range of 20%, that household debt being a range of 20% relative to their financial assets. And for our older households, it gets better and better than that perspective. And so that's a group of households that's sitting there with a pretty big financial buffer. Maybe they've already paid off, the mortgage on their home. And I think where you see a very different picture and one where it's really reflecting the challenges of the moment we're in today is when we start, going a little bit younger on that age spectrum to, those households that are kind of 44 and below. And that's where we really start to see that kind of household debt challenge emerge. And for that group of households, that same figure, that household debt, deflated by financial assets is well over 80%. And for the youngest households, it's basically hovering around 100% of their financial asset buffer. So we're seeing a group of households there that, are trying to kind of make their way into the world, hit these milestones like home ownership, but the reality is they don't have that same financial buffer out there to handle some of these macroeconomic shocks that they've had to deal with the past 3 years, and make some of these other cost of living challenges work from that perspective. And just if we're thinking about where they're going, another challenge they're really up against in the next little bit is the fact that home prices in this country have been, just growing well in excess of where median incomes have been going. So, if we just exclude Toronto and Vancouver, which, certainly are markets onto themselves when we're thinking about those affordability challenges, but just overall benchmark homes in Canada, excluding those two kind of really expensive markets, have just also been really outpacing median income growth. So the ratio of prices to median income, just in that overall kind of aggregate setting, is almost 6 times, median family income. And if we go back to 2005, that ratio was only 3. So a very different kind of perspective there. And if we're just focusing on Toronto and Vancouver, those are markets where that same ratio is well over 10 today. And so I think that's really speaking to a little bit of the challenge of where we are today and where we're likely to go. And so I guess what I wanted to, kind of get your view on here. So that's a pretty gloomy, dark kind of backdrop to, introduce our audience to here if they weren't already familiar with it. But do you think that recent federal budget that we had is going to dispel any of that darkness when it comes to, where we are on some of those generational fairness questions and that unaffordability aspect of life seemingly right now, Shelly?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think a lot of those exact narratives are very relevant right now for Canadians. I think there's something to be said about the fact that the federal budget used those exact concerns as a major talking point. It does speak to how pervasive these obstacles can be for younger generations. But when it comes down to the actual substance of the budget, a lot of the measures in there actually have very little impact. We did see some tax breaks, for example, on construction for purpose-built rentals and student rentals. But at this point, we've already seen a lot of measures by various levels of government to boost housing supply over the last few years, and frankly, they haven't really worked. The construction sector has been running at full capacity for a number of years now, and the only things it really responds to are changes in market conditions, things like constraints on labor or materials. So measures in the budget specifically, they could have an incremental impact on housing supply, but we're not really seeing any meaningful boost that would allow broader overall housing supply to keep up with the increase in demand that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, and I think that's the key point there is keeping up with demand. So it seems like, certainly the budget might not be quite the silver bullet for generational fairness, but, I guess if we're being a little bit charitable here, are there any maybe new programs or spending initiatives that in your mind kind of stand out as being relevant for younger investors?
Yeah, I mean, we do have some marginal support for the supply of rental units. For those looking to potentially purchase a home, the budget did bump up the RRSP withdrawal limit to the home buyers plan for first-time home buyers. And they also introduced 30-year amortization for first-time home buyers. And those are specifically for first-time home buyers looking to buy a new build. And of course, all of this comes after last year's introduction of the first home savings account. So all of these do boost demand, albeit it's still very much for a small portion of that market.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Certainly if I'm sitting here in Toronto today and thinking of where I'm going to find that new build house for me to take advantage of that program, there's, pretty slim pickings. And, I guess to maybe a little bit to your point there, and, feel free to disagree with me here if you think otherwise, but, a lot of those programs seem geared towards the idea of either lowering kind of a monthly payment there, if it's a 30-year amortization, or some of those other programs just give everyone a little bit more ammunition out there to bid up house prices further, as opposed to kind of maybe addressing the problem head on here, which is that, it's not house prices that are the challenge. It's the ratio between house prices and, where available financial assets and incomes are for younger households. So I don't know. To me, anyway, it seems like we're doing the exact opposite here.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where things get a bit tricky here. For all the discussion that we've seen on the housing market on demand versus supply, what's actually causing the problem, when you boil it all down to, history and the trends that we've seen, it's really demand growth that's been the outlier here, and certainly for the past decade or so. And so when you're trying to fix that imbalance between demand and supply, it's really the demand side that can actually respond much more quickly. So for example, if you think of higher mortgage rates putting a lid on housing demand over the last couple of years versus just how difficult it's been to get new supply to market despite all of that attention on it, it's really the demand side that, again, it has kind of been the source of this imbalance and also is the easier side to react as well.
Yeah, I mean, to me anyway, it seems like no one in Canada wants to admit the kind of hard truth here, which is that there's a pretty limited path or maybe a set of limited paths back to housing affordability in this country or, affordability writ large. And that either you need for the housing market a period of pretty flat nominal home price growth alongside certainly sturdier income growth than we've seen over the past few years, or kind of the darker way there, and I think this would be broadly unhelpful to the rest of the macroeconomy, is you would need a much bigger market correction than the one we've seen since the spring of 2022. And outside of that, I don't see a lot of other paths that are going to get us to somewhere where it's a lot easier for younger Canadians to participate in this kind of generational milestone.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's such a difficult message to digest here. If we want to bring housing affordability back down, something's got to give between house prices and people's incomes. Now, the idea would be to cool price growth enough to allow income growth to catch up, but not so much that it would hurt asset valuations for existing homeowners. And by the way, when we're talking about homeowners and asset valuations, it's not really a question of rich people versus poor people or older people versus young people, because many of the homeowners that would be most impacted by a severe housing market correction would be the people struggling to make mortgage payments right now, or if you think about people on lower incomes, like elderly folks, or just people struggling to get by at this point. Those would be the ones that would be quite strongly impacted by a severe market correction. So that's the main reason why we would want to avoid something like that. But yeah, getting back to your main point, I think, yes, we would need to see house price growth remain pretty subdued to help the affordability picture. So as counterintuitive as it sounds, the best way to help affordability would be to keep a lid on housing demand.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point you brought up about the idea that the households that are going to be the most affected by something like a bigger correction would be those people who are certainly buying more at the peak of the market in the last few years. And, broadly, that typically tends to be younger homeowners. And again, that's a group that would really see those things like their loan to value ratios really get out of control, for their next renewal if we saw kind of a bigger correction. So I think that's a really good, kind of thing to think about in the context of the discussion we're having. So one thing I wanted to kind of bring up was that in our write-up of the budget when it came out, we really highlighted that this was certainly raising the roof of on spending, which, not I would say a strange or remarkable story for the current government in power. But I think one thing I wanted to dig a bit deeper into is not just the idea that spending is potentially going up, but where is that spending itself going? And UBC professor Paul Kershaw had an editorial in the Globe and Mail that came out back in April, where he was sort of highlighting this idea that a lot of the increased spending in this budget over the next let's call it 4 to 5 years are going into programs like old age security, as well as things like interest on the public debt, just with given where, debt levels are and where interest rates are. And so, I don't know, to me anyway, those are programs, or you could call them initiatives, that mostly are kind of placing a burden on younger, households in this country. And the idea that in the future, they might face higher tax rates. These are all programs that are largely benefiting, a different group of Canadians than themselves. And so I guess, one thing that is worth kind of pointing out there is if you, kind of divvied up some of those spending programs as he does in that article, all of that new spending per person in the budget is about 4 times higher for our, so-called aging loved ones than, Canadians under 45. And, I think credit to the current government. That is an improvement from the last time a budget came out, where that same ratio was, 5.5 times. So, 5.5 times more spending per person on kind of aging loved ones than younger Canadians. But I guess, what's your take a little bit on that imbalance in spending at the federal level between kind of younger and older households? And, if someone had a magic wand here and made you kind of prime minister for the day, would there be any policies that you might want to kind of pursue in that lens of creating a little bit more generational fairness today?
Yeah, I think on the first point, I do just want to start off by saying that our population in Canada is skewing older now, as it is in many developed nations, just as the baby boomer generation ages into retirement. So I think to some degree, it does make sense that a chunk of net new spending in the budget would go to support older Canadians. But I think your point on public debt interest costs is a very good one. And it's one of the reasons why we, as economists, just watch government debt and spending levels so closely. Because the more debt that is accumulated, the more future generations will be using their tax dollars to pay interest on that debt instead of spending or investing in the priorities that matter to them. So that might not have been as much of a concern in the decade or so before the pandemic, when rates were near zero. But at this point, I do think it's something that younger Canadians should watch. So for your question on being prime minister for a day, if I only had a day, I think it would be a little hard. But I do think some of the existing supports we have for seniors already, like the old age security benefit that you mentioned, could be better targeted so that they're helping the seniors who need it most, while also reducing the debt burden that I mentioned for future generations. So it's more of a question on that better targeting to actually provide the support that is needed, while also maintaining that so-called fairness among generations.
I think that's a really good point about just what, interest payments are kind of doing to an economy, whether it's the Canadian economy or other economies these days, is that it really is taking away your ability to have that flexibility to, spend, new initiatives, whether it's to, certainly stimulate competition or productivity growth in this country, or, kind of provide, a bigger backstop to, some of the income security issues we're seeing today. So I think that's a really good point. And again, maybe one of the reasons why some of our audience members who, hear us talking about debt and deficits and they want to roll their eyes, but really, it does have this kind of first order potential impact on, the course of, where fiscal policy is going to intersect their lives in the future. So I think that's a really good one for people to think about. So I did want to maybe pivot a little bit. We've talked a lot about programs in the budget geared towards housing policy, but certainly one other, fundamental challenge that a lot of young Canadians are dealing with today is just the broader cost of living problem. And I think if, we focus on one thing in particular, so food prices, which is certainly a popular one, if you look at sort of where the trend in food prices has gone relative to where it would have been in the absence of the really big uptick in inflation we've seen, and in particular food inflation, is, food prices are about 14% higher today than they would have been otherwise. And so I think, that's something that's coming up every time, someone's going to the grocery store. Also, certainly when they're going out for dinner at a restaurant, these are all things that are just making it a lot more expensive to go about your day-to-day life. And I think at, about current rates of income growth, the challenge is that cost of living, or that very salient category of this cost of living pressure, is potentially going to be with us for, almost the next decade if, income growth kind of stays at its, relatively slow growth level that we've seen over the last several years. So I guess I did wanted to, tease out with you, were there any programs in this budget that were, geared towards, or in your view, are going to do a potentially good job of trying to turn around this productivity challenge we've had in Canada, and maybe spur a little bit more income growth where we might see that challenge kind of maybe sped up a little bit, rather than being with us for potentially the next decade?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question right now, and it's a really good thing to keep in mind when we are talking about income growth, especially in this current period of, high inflation, trying to bring inflation back down to target. Of course, we do want people's incomes to rise, but if the reasons for that aren't things like higher productivity, we could run into another inflationary spiral where those higher incomes don't actually add to prosperity for Canadians. So the question of how we boost productivity, that's really a decades old problem in Canada. And there are likely no easy fixes here. Some ideas that have gained traction, at least in the US, include using AI, especially for tasks that might be repetitive or time consuming. But really, attracting investment is a broader goal that could bring more highly productive jobs to the country. And that would be in AI, but also like in areas such as clean energy or technology, for example. But I will just also point out that business investment into Canada has also been pretty lackluster in recent years. So attracting that sort of investment would likely require additional policy changes, very broad-based policy changes. And that's really not something that has been meaningfully addressed really in this budget or over the past few years. Like I said, it's really been a decades-long problem at this point.
Yeah, exactly. We're sort of in a bit of a rut here. I mean, and I think it's fair to say there's a lot of other advanced economies, not including the US, that have also, been in a little bit of a productivity rut. But yeah, it's definitely one that we're going to need to think hard about if we want to, kind of secure a little bit of a better future when it comes to this affordability challenge in the next several years as we go ahead here. So I know along those lines of thinking about policy and where kind of the investment climate is in this country today, one topic that certainly has been getting a lot of discussion and a lot of attention is the adjustments to the capital gains inclusion rate. And so I was wondering, can you walk us through, what changed in the budget and how it might affect younger investors here?
Sure. So the capital gains tax, it's applied when you're selling an investment at a profit. So for example, if you're selling stocks or a house. Now, previously, 50% of those gains were taxable. So the other half was tax-free, but the budget raised the share of gains that are subject to that tax to two-thirds. So going from 50% is taxable to now two-thirds are taxable. And that's for people with gains of more than $250,000, as well as all corporations and trusts. So because of that $250,000 threshold on individual gains, the burden of that tax change is much likelier to fall on wealthier Canadians or older Canadians, and especially those Canadians that are looking to sell a house, because really across Canada right now, it's really hard to find a house that's worth less than $250,000 at this point.
No, exactly. That's a very good point. And certainly if it's, at least if it's their principal residence, certainly they're exempt from that. But yes, the dream of a $250,000 house in Canada seems a fading one unless something drastic sort of changes in the next little bit here. And I guess, the way I think about this a little bit is if we're just thinking, from the pure kind of economist hat sometimes I put on, I do sometimes appreciate the direction of, capital gains inclusion going up from this idea of achieving horizontal equity in our tax system, which is basically just the idea that if we take a dollar of corporate income and if we give that dollar to dividends, if we give that dollar to capital gains, or we pay that dollar out in labor income, the tax system should all treat them relatively the same. And certainly we weren't doing that before. We were taxing dividends and labor income more than we were taxing capital gains. So I think it is good to move a little bit more towards that horizontal equity piece from, again, the pure, econ version of the way I think about things. But I do think it was a really big missed opportunity in the context that you brought up of a challenging backdrop to, competition, business investment in this country. And, there were lots of things you could have done alongside this change to, ease the tax burden and, bring us a little bit better back in line with where we used to be on a, corporate tax competitive basis with the United States. So, whether that was taking the opportunity to make this revenue neutral by, either cutting personal income taxes, by cutting corporate income taxes. But, there are lots of things you could have done along that lens to kind of provide a better backdrop for, maybe creating the conditions that will, lead to stronger productivity growth in this country over the next little bit. So I did kind of want to pull the conversation together here. And, if I'm being a little bit charitable, I would say, both that the budget isn't going to shake up the status quo when we think about, where fairness today is in this country for younger generations, but perhaps, on the margin, there are a few initiatives here that, certainly younger investors, younger households might be a little bit excited about if it's, a relevant case for, their specific, situation that they might find them in. Do you think that's a fair characterization in your view of the budget?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's interesting now that millennials and, Generation Z are aging into the prime working age groups and the prime voting age groups. So I think we're likely going to see more and more messaging targeted towards them in the years to come. Now, of course, the other side to that is millennials and Gen Z are also aging as that happens. So they won't necessarily be the youngest Canadians anymore, so to speak. But I think that's an important point to remember when we're talking about things like, generational fairness and economic fairness. As we, as millennials and Gen Z, start to age, and as younger generations come up as well, I think we can use those lessons that we are learning right now to hopefully set up, a better future or a more prosperous future for the next cohort of younger Canadians. So I think that's a good lesson to keep in mind.
Okay. Well, I won't hold it against you that you said we're no longer younger anymore, but I guess that's the reality of getting older as well. Well, anyway, Shelly, I just wanted to thank you so much for the great discussion today, and hopefully we'll have you back on the podcast to discuss any future changes in the Canadian public policy landscape. So thanks for listening today, and I hope it helps you sort out some of the facts from the spin about the latest budget, and we look forward to chatting again soon. Bye now.
Thanks so much.